What happens if we dare to tear off the mask of professionalism and actually risk showing up for real? I'm your host, Miriam Hartness, and this is Unprofessionalism.
I'll always remember one of the first of these large conferences that I ran on 4 different continents over 5 years that Tony showed up to. And I was nervous. And he watched, he observed, and near the end of the first day, he gets up on stage and takes the microphone. And I don't know what he's going to acknowledge or say. And what he acknowledges that what he saw, in his words, were an esprit de corps. He saw a spirit in the culture that what he felt as he witnessed it was our most important strategic and competitive advantage. And I've avoided saying this during our conversation, but just to be clear, we grew from 175 to 600 salespeople, from 40 to 190 million in revenue. So when I say we had a good time, the business numbers were there.
Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Miriam. Happy to be here.
It's amazing to have you here and to explore the edges of professionalism and unprofessionalism with you. And I'll kick it right off, always with the same question. When was a time that you realized that being unprofessional was maybe the best move you could have done?
That's a wonderful question. So I'll share a story that I don't know that I've ever told this, but it's a good example. I don't know if I was smart on purpose, but it was me being me, and it played out well. I was facilitating an experience for a conference for an organization called the Arthur Page Society. In the Arthur Page Society, their members are heads of communication for many of the largest companies in the world. And it was both a great honor to get to facilitate an experience, and because of who was in the room and who the organization is, there were parts of me that were a little bit intimidated, which made what I'm about to tell you all the more interesting for me in the moment. My workshop was at about 11 a.m., and I was in the room from the start of the day. And I noticed that the participants, remember, these are senior executives, C-level leaders. To be in the room, I think you had to be like $1 billion organization. And the first thing I noticed, I can't help it as a facilitation teacher, and you'd appreciate this, is that with all the seating in the room, everybody sat filling up the back first. So the front section of tables was essentially empty. And maybe nobody else noticed that. For me, it was like the first thing I'm fixating on. I thought, that's interesting energetically. I don't know how I feel about that. So I had a debate in my mind for the next couple of hours. Like, am I going to address this? Or am I going to lead a workshop from a stage for these very senior people and have an entire section that's empty? And of course, I decided I'll just follow whatever happens in the moment. And so I walked up on the stage and I decided to just be me and follow my truth, which was address this issue in my mind. And I asked them if they wanted to, they could make the choice to fill in the front section. And the looks that I got at first, it was like, there's no way he's serious. And then I stated my point again. I say, hey, this is for your benefit, your experience. It's up to you if you want. And a number of them got up and moved forward. Anyways, I went on, led the workshop. And there's 2 endings to the story that are worth noting. I had somebody come up to me not long after, and it went well, pretty well enough. And somebody said to me, they said, Jon, this is a room of people that in their careers, nobody has ever told them where to sit in a room like this. And I said, well, now there's the first, right? But what I'll tell you is some very prestigious large companies in that room ended up hiring me and our company. And it led to a very significant amount of revenue for us across 3 different Fortune 50 companies that everybody would know. And so in retrospect, I don't know that they hired me because they saw that I was willing to move people to the front of the room, but it was certainly an act in the moment that I think some may have thought was unprofessional. So that's a story that came up as soon as I saw this question.
Thank you. I love this story on so many levels, and especially with the comment that nobody ever told them where to sit. And yet to speak out the invitation and give them the choice for them to basically, that's what I hear. Are you ready to really dive into the experience, or do you just want to be a bystander?
Yeah.
Yeah. What have you learned from that experience subsequently?
That particular experience, I don't know if I've reflected much. I mean, in the moment with you right now, the opportunity it led to certainly reminds me that it can be okay to take risks and be ourselves. Of course, not every risk is going to lead to the kind of positive outcome that one did. And you can relate to this, and you know this about me, I've been on many stages facilitating many rooms of leaders, and knowing kind of my upbringing and where I came from, the audience doesn't often know this, but I've had to overcome tremendous insecurity and trauma and fears and doubts and self-judgment. And I've continually been reminded that when I can find the courage and the presence to be who I am, and there's a line, by the way, there's a point where, being who I am is important, and there's an unending question. I don't have some rule. I don't have some definitive answer, but it's a responsibility and a privilege that I'm given to stand in front of and lead a group. So I have to remember why I'm there. And being myself is important for a multitude of reasons. And I got to be careful as to whether I'm doing that for one reason or for my ego, which then gets in the way of serving the group.
Yeah.
So I think what I've learned is it's important to continually do the kind of interpersonal work so that I can be more comfortable being who I am in the presence of who's given me the privilege to lead. And I've got to stay connected to the highest purpose of being in that room and knowing when and where it's appropriate and okay to evolve or adapt how I show up.
Yeah.
It's hard to know where to draw that line for me sometimes.
Yeah, and that's where the intuition comes in. And I think, as you said, the being connected to the higher purpose. Whom are we in service to? Is it ourselves and our ego, or actually the group? And you said something at the beginning of your anecdote that there was an energy component to the fact that they were not filling up the first rows, so to speak. And I think that energy drain that happens if people are not sitting close together, when they're avoiding proximity, when they're also avoiding the stage, meaning reminds me of stand-up comedy, where nobody wants to sit in the first row because they know that they will be the target. And maybe in a workshop, it might feel similar. So what I hear is you inviting the group to fill up that space wasn't because your insecurity speaking to avoid, but inviting them to really do the work and come closer to each other. And that's the energy you need in order to get something moving in the space.
Yeah. Well, I like to think that. I'd like to think that my invitation was in service of their experience and their learning. And even if I was coming from a place of my own insecurity about speaking to that empty row, that's not a problem. If it ends up helping and serving and solving and healing the way that they're in that room, then maybe it's all okay. So that's true. I'd like to think it was in service of the higher purpose versus my ego.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important for me in a moment like that to be careful in the story I then make up about all of them in that room, right? Because then that becomes a distraction. And I have to remember that they're just sitting in there the way they are, maybe because of how they were released from breakfast, or maybe because they're just attending the way people do in our modern meeting culture. And is it their fault that that culture is guided by paradigms that are outdated or need to be redone? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, two things come to my mind. One is we first have to feel safe ourselves before we can create the safety for others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially, as you said, if we grow up knowing how it is to be this insecure, then it might be also easier to relate to those who might feel insecure. I think we often forget how risky and vulnerable it is to be part of a workshop, where suddenly there's someone on stage asking us to get involved and not to lean back and to take notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What helped you for your personal transformation to leave, or maybe to use your past as a catapult to your current and future self to transform groups, to step in front of them, to invite them to transform?
Well, to me, it's interesting to continually nurture my relationship with my own story about my past, because it's taken me a long time, but with wonderful teachers who've helped me to understand that I can create anew my story with my past, and that can change how I can stand in the present. And it's taken me a long time to understand how I ended up where I am today as a facilitator or a facilitation teacher, because I failed my way out of the traditional education system. And I went through a series of events as a young person. I was in 4 different schools within a 5-year span between the ages of about, 13 and 17 or so. And I see the look on your face. You don't need me to tell you any more stories. You understand? Yeah. So you used the word belonging earlier. During a really critical period of my life as a teenager, I did not belong. I was afraid of just being seen by others. And so it's interesting because fast forward, that was 30-ish years ago. And today, if somebody were to ask me, what's central to everything I do and stand for, it's creating conditions where others feel a sense of belonging so that they can tap into their higher creative, learningful selves. So it's interesting what you're saying and what you're asking, because in some way, everything I'm doing is some attempt to resolve or heal some aspect of my past self.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I am. The audience did not see my face, but thinking of changing schools so often in this important age of puberty, and how cool teenagers can be, and how difficult it is then so it can be traumatic experience to start in music so many times in this age. And I can totally relate to what you say, and often have the impression when I interview other entrepreneurs or facilitators that at the end of the day, we all try to solve our own problems with the work that we are doing, which I think is a beautiful thing, because then it really comes from our heart and our soul, and we feel for the problem that we are trying to solve. And I would love to double click on what you say about belonging, because when I think of belonging and business, I wonder where the connection is, especially when we think of professionalism, and especially when I still have this image of this workshop space in mind where everyone is sitting apart, which is the opposite of belonging.
Yeah. Well, I'll respond to your question by sharing a story about a time in my career where I really accidentally was realizing how valuable belonging is. And your question about, the role of belonging in a business setting as an example. I was a head of sales for the Vitamix Corporation. They make these nice blenders. And Vitamix today is a 100-plus-year-old company. And I came into Vitamix at a pretty young age. I was 26 or 27 years old, and I had this very significant responsibility. And speaking of unprofessionalism, one of the reasons that experience was so fulfilling and rewarding for me is the CEO at the time, Jody Berg, who was, by the way, the great-granddaughter of Bill Barnard, who founded the company, which is its own really inspiring story. She and her cousin, Lori Connors, the CFO, they were the ones who brought me in. And when they interviewed me, even before I was hired, they said, hey, we're bringing somebody like you in, not because we think you're going to have all the answers, but because we want you to use your strengths. And they really gave me permission to be me. Mm. And one of the challenges I was navigating is I had this global sales force, and a lot of the difference we were trying to make was through all the meetings that we led, which is what led to the eventual founding of our company today. And remember, I'm somebody who could barely sit in a classroom, and I already think most meetings are a waste of time. And now I'm in charge of all the sales meetings for this global sales force. And so I immediately thought, if we're smarter about how we lead these meetings, where just from an accounting standpoint, these meetings were one of our largest investments. And yet I'm sitting there thinking these things hinge on being a total waste, or they could be really pivotal. And over about 5 years, through experimentation and using some strengths of mine, we led and designed meetings in a way where I didn't have a vocabulary for it at the time, but I was prioritizing how we were connecting people with each other. And I didn't understand what I was doing, but I was creating these conditions along with our leadership team where people felt so safe being themselves. You know, a scientist would look at it and go, oh yeah, humans co-regulate, right? And you're creating the right conditions for a neurobiological regulated nervous system. I didn't understand any of that back then. All I understood was in my gut. I felt like if we led these meetings in a way where we didn't leave connection to the cracks and crevices, but we actually made it the centerpiece, then all the learning and problem solving would work so much better. And it turned out to be true. And it was an epic experience those 5 years. We grew by leaps and bounds in revenue and the size of our team. But it was an accidental learning that if we optimize the design and facilitation of our meetings for people to feel connected and safe, that everything else that we said mattered would become more accessible, more possible to achieve. So there was a serious business case. At the time, I didn't know what we were doing. And all people cared about was, were we getting results? And we were. But in retrospect, it was where I was really understanding that if you deliver on the human need for communal and social capital through how we bring people together, that it unlocks their creative and intellectual capital in ways that you just can't do if you keep running these meetings in such a traditional, professional sense. So,
yeah. And before I ask you for maybe one ingredient that you changed, one thing that crossed my mind was, or what I hear, and you called it accidental change. And what I hear is that you trusted your gut, and that how you felt about the experience was not only about you, but might translate to a larger proportion of the people around. And it makes me think of these moments where we sit in meetings or any situation thinking, is it only me who feels kind of weird about something, and not daring to act upon us because we think everyone else seems to work for everyone else, so it must be me, so I better shut up. But then taking the leap of faith and thinking, if this doesn't work for me, maybe it's a larger problem, maybe it doesn't work for other people either, and then speaking up and making the change usually when we raise our hand and saying, okay, I don't understand that, there's this, finally some. So I can see that the trust in your own experience and not gaslighting yourself, but taking it seriously and thinking, this must be a bigger issue. So thank you for sharing that story. I think there's so much power in that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because today, and this is years later, I think about a design principle that we think about in our facilitation teaching, which is designing an experience that even if nobody were to show up, it would transform me, the designer. Now, I understand in certain contexts that doesn't always translate, but in many environments, I mean, I have a 300-person annual event we lead called Transformation by Design for our students. That event is design, Miriam. So if nobody's there, it'll be the best 2.5 days of my life.
I wanted to stand up and dance on the table when you said that. Because when I hosted Never Done Before, community for facilitators doing something for the first time there was one community member, and she asked me, Miriam, I do want to step up and I want to do something, but she was shy. She didn't have the self-confidence. And then I asked her, okay, what is the one thing you could host of which you would learn the most even if nobody shows up?
Beautiful.
Hearing this from you, founder of Explain, I was like, yes.
That's beautiful.
So my little moment of pride. What was the one thing that you changed back then in the ways you convened with the teams?
Well, there was more than one thing, but if I had to point it to one thing, and I'll answer both sides of what I'm addressing here. We did a number of things, but they all pointed to a change in belief about what is possible when a group of people come together, and a change in belief about what it means to honor the wisdom that is in the room, not on the stage. And I can say this today, and I know this can sound eloquent and it sounds very clear. At the time, I was learning about appreciative inquiry directly from David Cooper-Ryder, because I'm here in Cleveland, and he eventually became a mentor and a peer. But I'm taking these different modalities that basically say, when you're running these meetings, like, if you do things in a certain way, you can tap into an intelligence and a collective potential in the room. That was really the transcendent shift, is realizing we're going to run these meetings in a way that are honoring the intelligence that's in the room. And number two, we're going to honor that the intelligence lives in the whole person, not just in the head. So I'll just double click and give you an example of, like, if someone's listening saying, well, I agree with everything you're saying, but what did you do in your meetings? I'll just give a couple examples. First of all, I brought in a DJ. And we had music playing all throughout the meeting. Because one thing I knew as somebody, I didn't tell you this part of my story, my way out of failing out of education was entrepreneurship. Was in sales. And so I just started saying, well, if I wanted to make these meetings awesome no matter what would I do? DJ, that's number one. Number two, how do I make the learning entertaining? And I had these two friends who at the time had an incredible business teaching improv skills to professional salespeople. So I gave them half a day. I said, I know how skilled you are. You take 3 hours and have us play games and tell jokes. But of course, anybody who knows, they know it's way more than just playing games. It's teaching profound lessons through embodied experiences, right? I brought in a mindfulness meditation coach. And then when it was time for, like, okay, well, Jon, what else are you going to do beyond all these crazy ideas? We didn't sit in rows. We sat in circles. And instead of having a few of our top salespeople tell everybody what they did, I said, I don't want a few people telling everyone else. I want everyone in the room showing each other what you're doing, and then using processes that were very messy. I had them crowdsource, kind of vote up and nominate their peers, so that now we'd have 10 to 15 salespeople doing their presentation in front of 200 or 300. But I didn't predetermine. It wasn't a prefixed agenda. I wanted them to nominate each other in real time. And it was dynamic. That by the nature of how it was all very organic, combined with the entertainment. And I got to say one more thing. I spent twice as much money on food compared to what they were previously spending. And it wasn't because I was increasing the quantity. I wanted nutrient-dense food. So everything was high quality because we were going to have a lot of fun and we were going to do some serious work, as serious as I could be. And so to me, it was like, we got to honor the whole person in the room, from everything that goes in their mouth to everything that goes in their ears to how many of each other's eyes are you looking into while you're learning. And I was just kind of this crazy entrepreneur who had a suit on up top, and I would be barefoot, and we had an incredible 5 years.
Literally barefoot?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Literally. Yeah.
While you were speaking, I took some notes, and the barefoot connects very well to it. So I wrote down woo woo hippie.
Yeah. I don't mind that. I don't mind that.
And I love woo woo hippie. How did your peers, your bosses, react to that? Because from what you say at the beginning, they brought you in because they trusted you and the way you're doing things, instead of kind of creating this space. And still, I can imagine that for people who usually come in their time, their suit to work, suddenly this kind of process with DJ and improv can look literally unprofessional.
It sure can. So I mentioned 2 of our executives already, Lori and Jody. They were the ones who brought me in. And they brought me in because they had heard about me and even seen me facilitate at another conference. So they had an insight into what they were getting themselves into. So that's just an alignment between what they stood for and me being me. There was another gentleman, though, who I think he really appreciated my business or entrepreneurial acumen and my work ethic, but I don't think he knew as much about my style. And I remember one of our sales conference, and he was our COO at the time, and his name is Tony Sepiel. And Tony became maybe one of the most meaningful business mentors I've ever had. And Tony, just like Lori and Jody, he trusted me to the moon and back. So this is really an acknowledgement, I believe, of them being an example of what I think a leader ought to be, is being willing to trust in others. And I'll always remember one of the first of these large conferences that I ran on 4 different continents over 5 years that Tony showed up to. And I was nervous. And he watched, he observed, and near the end of the first day, he gets up on stage and takes the microphone. And I don't know what he's going to acknowledge or say. And what he acknowledges that what he saw, in his words, were an esprit de corps. He saw a spirit in the culture that what he felt as he witnessed it was our most important strategic and competitive advantage. And I've avoided saying this during our conversation, but just to be clear, we grew from 175 to 600 salespeople, from 40 to 190 million in revenue. So when I say we had a good time, the business numbers were there. And what Tony acknowledged at the point he said that was kind of like halfway up that rise in business performance, is he had a lot of experience and he could see that we were genuinely building the kind of culture that could then go deliver on a strategy and a growth story. So that's what my supervisors and bosses all saw, or how they responded. And I still know today that that's not always the norm. And I was very fortunate to have the mentors while I was at that company that I did.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, and really gives hope that when the company values are really infused in the way the people meet and do things, because how we do one thing is how we do everything, right? And what sounds like a red thread is that the authentic aspect of being me, trusting your gut and doing things how they feel right to you with integrity, seems to be the best business booster, the best marketing thing.
Yeah. And I believe what you're saying has become even more true just in the last handful of years. I believe that people they're just yearning for, they want so deeply, not just to be led by, but to be in environments where they can be their true selves, their whole selves, their real selves. And I think a lot of folks in the workforce, they don't use this language that we're using. They don't even know what it is they're yearning for, but it's that deep, deep human desire for wholeness. And when people feel like they've got to leave something at home or be somebody or something different, the amount of energetic waste that creates. And it is, you want to talk about hitting the bottom line. If people are wasting all this energy on performing and figuring out what to wear and what to say and how to attend a meeting, that energy is not available for creativity. That energy is not available for more authentic, deep, meaningful relationships. It's not available to innovate new products or find new markets. So it's interesting that what you stand for, this unprofessionalism, professionalism discussion, I think so much of what creates waste are often these things that people would call an invitation to be professional, at least in the traditional sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of the time that is needed to adjust to a script that is usually not even publicly available. So when we go to a meeting and think that we have to adjust our language, ask the right questions, the time gap this creates between, oh, I have an idea, I want to ask a question, then unconsciously or consciously checking all the boxes. Is this appropriate? Can I do that? Am I using the right language? What will the other people say? Time is already over. And the group might be at the next topic yet. So I think there's a real cost to that, not to allow following our gut at the risk that maybe sometimes we make mistakes. Maybe sometimes we ask something stupid.
Yeah.
I would like to tap into your experience training, educating facilitators and being a facilitator for big companies yourself, because I like to compare facilitators with leaders. I think not only there are a lot of leadership capacities that a facilitator brings to the room, but also there's a sort of authority that you're either on the front or the back of the room on stage. But what you say, usually people follow. And I think if you can lead with authenticity and if you can model the behavior that you want to see, you can have a big impact. So I would be curious in your experience of being a facilitator and training facilitators of the impact we might have or the cost if we don't.
Well, I love this question for so many reasons in this topic. I think a facilitator, generally speaking, is often the most influential person in a room. Now, you and I know what I mean when I say that. And anybody who's been trained or leads group experiences understands what I mean when I say a facilitator is the most influential person in a room. The rest of the room may not see it that way. They may not respect the role or the profession necessarily, but that doesn't mean the facilitator doesn't still need to take the kind of responsibility that somebody should if you have that kind of privileged influence with a room. And your question around what can and cannot become possible, I think when we take this topic of professionalism or unprofessionalism, part of the facilitator's responsibility is to somehow create the conditions for that room to bring out their best self collectively and individually. And I think what we all know by now, who have all been in any space learning about leading groups, is that there is a direct correlation between the capacity of a group to be together skillfully, to think, to create, to solve, right? Like whatever the reason is, there's the universal reason is they all want something tomorrow to be different from today.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know now that that capacity of that room is going to be in direct alignment with the nervous system of the room and the people in that room. And the way we teach facilitation, and as you know, it's facilitation is one leg of a three-legged stool. Like knowing what you're designing is just as important as facilitation. Those are two skills that have to get matched together. But when we look at great facilitation, there's everything you see above the surface. There's everything that's visible, right? There's the processes and the questions and the instructions. And then there's what's invisible, what's below the surface. And that's where your question about how influential a facilitator is, that's, to me, where all of that hinges upon is what's happening below the surface. Because whatever is going on in the facilitator, in terms of their capacity to be comfortable being in their own skin, which is so much easier to say than it is to do. I can do yoga and breath work and eat food and pray and qigong every day. And if I get enough of the right eyeballs looking at me, all of a sudden I'm insecure again, right? Which, I mean, it's true. So I think that part of our responsibility as facilitators is to know that whatever, that's my journey, but whatever each of us does, to do our own healing, which to me is the core of being able to be ourselves and love ourselves and know ourselves, is we got to do the deeper inner work. When we do that inner work, it's not about the DJ or am I wearing shoes or not. It's about everybody's nervous system in that room can completely relax when mine is relaxed. That's why you know this, and anyone who's facilitated for any period of time knows that the ultimate compliment that you get is how calm you are as a facilitator. Because that means the room was calm. And if they're calm, that translates to higher thinking.
Yeah.
So your question around influence or impact, I'm just using the question as a chance to advocate for A, how influential facilitators are, and B, it always begins and ends with our inner work. And if I could just say one more thing about this, for somebody who's newer, because you asked about through the lens of as a facilitation teacher, if somebody's newer to leading groups, they're afraid of the very thing that somebody who's more experienced prays for. And that's for things to go sideways. Because we call these the moments that matter most. Because when all of a sudden the unexpected, or somebody in the room takes over, or something goes a direction that clearly is not what was planned. When you're new, you're afraid of that because you're not sure if you're equipped, which might be true. But when you're more experienced, you really desire those moments. Because, you know, in those moments when things go sideways, there's a concentration effect, a concentration of time within which people's trust in me will either accelerate or decelerate. And the core factor is the work I've done before I walked into that room to regulate my own nervous system. Because if I can handle it in a regulated way, I can win over a room in an instant in ways that when everything goes according to plan, this guy's just on his thing and they're hardly paying attention. Anyways, you'd asked about our impact, and these are some things that come up for me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the co-regulation part is so important. If we can stay calm and trust our own capacity as well as the groups, they will sense that there is this calm and there is the space to tap into this collective wisdom that we're always talking about. But these are the moments where it can unfold. And I think what you said about the authenticity, the you being you and doing the healing work, yeah, it sounds so easy. You do a little bit of yoga class and some retreats and meditation. And then still, I once realized recently that nobody has ever told me that growing up never ends. When you're 18 or 21, you're like, okay, I'm a grown up now. But that's actually only where it starts. It's not where it ends. And I have the impression that being authentic is actually the most scary thing and the most vulnerable thing that we could possibly do. Because then any criticism and any doubt goes directly on us without blaming, oh, this is the way how we do it. Oh, that's a professional way. I was just attuning to the guidelines or the script. And I think to create the space to help an entire group to go there, to trust their own authenticity, that's a very high art and potentially the most unprofessional, right? Because literally it's letting down the guard of professionalism.
Yeah. Yeah. But what's beautiful is when it happens, and you've seen it, I'm certain, maybe quite a few times. Anybody who's ever been in a room where something happens, somebody says something, somebody reveals something, somebody admits they're wrong or that they don't know, somebody shows some true, honest part of themselves, the way that it can create a quantum leap in safety. And I mean that literally, like space and time. A room of people can open up in that collective authenticity in an instant. And it's beautiful when it happens. The scary thing is when there's not a skilled facilitator and a room perpetuates collective inauthenticity. And the reason that's so scary is because, in the words of a teacher of mine years ago, Fred Kaufman, that there is no greater corruption of the organizational soul than to say we are one way, but we actually behave another way. So to me, whether it's as a facilitator, a coach, a therapist, a business leader, an entrepreneur, the title, who cares? If we can contribute to others feeling a little safer just being themselves, or collectively through how we lead groups, that's important work. It's really important.
Yeah. And then to step into, or to take on the responsibility, or to at least be aware of it, that we have that. Do you have a trick or a way to crack the mask, the guard open? Because I guess I assume that you feel it. You step into a room and you can feel whether you have an army of soldiers, of corporate soldiers in front of you, or more of the hippies. How does it change, or what do you do in order to help them to crack open? Because it must be carefully done. Otherwise, they hide behind their shell and they don't come out. Then you're the hippie, and you're the
Yeah. And in many of the rooms that I'm in, it's important for me to be able to adapt how I step into the room so that some aspect of my personality doesn't get in the way of the bigger mission. So I'm willing to put on shoes. I'm willing to even wear a tie on rare occasion. But a lesson I learned years ago when I was training a group in Japan, at the beginning of an 11-day trip, I was invited into the home of one of the business professionals who was going to be in this group. And when I walked in the home, the first thing they had me do was take my shoes off. And I often use this story as a reminder, because at that time in my life, in my own home back here in the States, I did not take my shoes off. And I only give this example, even though it could sound trivial, I don't think it is, because it's an example of adapting how I walk into a room so that I'm not being so disrespectful that I get in the way of the relationship. And that's an example of knowing when I ought to evolve how I walk in. Now, your question, though, was like, what's the trick? And how do you do it with reverence? How do you really respect the privilege, but also how do you create that opportunity? I really think it does come down to two things. My presence is one, and we've already acknowledged that. So I do want to say something about the processes that we use. So our process that we've developed over the years at Xchange, which is an interdisciplinary approach, we bring in learning from many places. But at the core of our process it's embarrassingly simple. It's about the questions that we design and the conversations we choreograph. mean, if you watch everything we do and everything we teach, we have these certifications and we can get really deep and technical and specific and precise. But the core of everything we do is about the power of a question and what we call a conversational choreography. We have a half a dozen different ways of designing how groups interact, and anyone who facilitates has all these things. But I think not losing sight of how important it is for the process itself to invite the conditions that we want. I'll tell you what I do not do and what we do not teach. This will be a confrontation. There will be some who will hear this who will say, oh, he had me until that moment. Good thing we saved it, right?
Bring it on.
I do not believe in ground rules. We don't use ground rules. Now, years ago I did, until I was doing some work in Munich at BMW. And I was working with their autonomous driving division, and I met a gentleman there who was an incredible systems thinker. And he was quizzing me. He said, why do you think your process works? And I said, oh, this or that or this. He said, that all may be true. He said, your process is working because the most powerful culture you will ever create is not the culture you create through command or control or coercion, which to me, ground rules are that just nicely dressed up. He said the most powerful culture comes through the structures of what we do. Culture follows structure. So when the structure of the question and the structure of how we give space to people to reflect on that question is presented, just as an example, one small part of our process, that in and of itself, one of the most powerful ways to shift a room from being reactive and fragmented and stressed or distracted is bringing the question in, giving them space to think about it, creating space for reflection and contemplation. And then when we connect people to each other, now this is going to sound so elementary, but as a facilitator, giving reverence and respect to the clarity and the precision of my instructions is really important. Because I'm a free-spirited guy. You figured me out. I didn't have to tell you. I was born in California. You figured me out, right? Just in this conversation. But when I'm leading a group, the color of my pen, the cadence of my voice, the choice of every word is very intentional. Because ultimately, good facilitation is managing energy and attention, and we've got to have precision in our instructions so there's no waste when people go into the flow of the conversation. So you asked, Jon, what are the keys to inviting that safety and vulnerability? It sounds too simple and almost mundane to be true. But the faster we get the room turning eye to eye with each other, the faster we can move towards that safety, right? And so you notice what's interesting about what I'm saying right now is I want to put more weight on the process than on me. Because if I have to be so regulated and so amazing and so present and authentic, that's a lot of pressure. Because some days I am and some days I'm not as that. But if the process we use can do the heavy lifting, that's great news. And as a default, when I walk in a room and I've lost my mind and my presence and I forgot my process, I just ask the room to turn to each other and to greet each other. Hey, can you just take a minute and welcome each other? Every facilitator's got to have about a dozen ways to do some version of that. Because if you want to heal anything that's not healthy, just turn people back to each other. It's amazing how often that will start the repair or the strengthening right there. So that's what comes up in response to the invitation.
Thank you. And it's funny, I realized I started every workshop during the Never Done Before years with a turn to your neighbor moment. So within the first 5 minutes, I said, okay, throw you into one-on-one breakouts. You have a conversation. And I always thought that I'm doing this for the best of the group so that they can connect and feel safe and come back with a friend and use their vocal cords. And it was only recently that I realized that I was basically doing it for myself. So that I come in the room, I'm like, oh, so many people. Then I send them away, and after 5 minutes, they come back. They're connected, regulated, and I'm also regulated.
Well, that's called reciprocal causality for the systems geeks, right? What goes on in you is going to go on in them and vice versa. What's good for you is good for them, and what's good for them is good for you. Both can be true, and that's great.
Yeah. And what really came out for me in this last bit you shared is how complex it is to balance this professionalism and unprofessionalism in a way that it resonates and works. Because I hear the highly professional process, the thinking about the words, the instructions, so that people don't doubt themselves. Oh, I didn't understand. I wasn't good enough. No, you're so precise that nobody has to waste that energy, that everyone feels well held in the process, and still being yourself and all of that, so that you can bring your own lightness and spirit to that, so that the group can also feel that they can be authentic in this. And I think that's highly complex and really shows how important both are.
It is. It is, because I'm complex, you're complex, every human being is. And then you, like you said, I, as a facilitator, I have all the pressure of wanting to serve the group. And over time, hopefully I know how to convert that pressure into my highest creativity, but it's still there. It comes from a place of care. But I'm also a dad of 5 kids. I've also got a mom who just passed away. I've also divorced in the last 5 years. I also have one moment where we're respected as the best in the world, and the same day I'm questioning the purpose of our company.
Mm.
So that's just the human experience. And it's so my heart goes out to everybody, whether you identify as a facilitator, a coach, a consultant, a leader. When you take on the responsibility to serve a group of people, there's a whole lot that you have to navigate that's in the room and that's not in the room. And it's not always easy.
Yeah. Final question. What is an unprofessional thing that you would still advise other people to do?
An unprofessional thing that I would still advise other people to do. Well, to express yourself in a way that feels true for you, even if you're scared, and just to know that choosing to express some part of your truth, especially when you're scared, it doesn't mean that what you're going to express will be done perfectly, obviously, but the more we can all find the courage, I believe, when hinging between taking a risk and not, to find a way to be more true to ourselves, I think we all win. So whether that means play the music, or dance a little bit, or don't wear shoes, or use profanity, if you're on the fence, lean in. It might help somebody else who's paying attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, your openness, your sharing, Jon.
Miriam, it's an honor to be with you exploring this topic of unprofessional. It feels like I was born to be unprofessional.
Yay! Thank you. And we'll put all the contact details to your training, your company, your profile in the show notes.
This was a conversation without the script. Now it's your turn. I'm Miriam Hatmas, and this has been Unprofessionalism.